So you want to get into barefoot shoes and start wearing them for some daily wear, walking and working out, but you've never worn them before. Should you just jump straight to this style of footwear? That's probably not the best idea, and let me explain why. So barefoot shoes are interesting because unlike other types of shoes, when you make the switch to barefoot shoes, you're going to want to acclimate and ease yourself into the style of footwear, especially if you plan to go hard in the gym in them or make the shift full time to wearing barefoot shoes. Now, why is that? So let's say you've been wearing like running shoes or shoes with thicker midsoles your entire life. What you're gonna feel in that type of shoe versus a barefoot shoe is very different. And now more specifically, when you have a barefoot shoe on, you have a lot more flexibility. Basically, your foot might be moving through ranges of motion that it doesn't typically get exposed to when you're wearing your traditional shoes. On top of this, there's the muscles and tissues that surround the foot and ankle, the intrinsic and deeper tissues and muscles that might not have as much exposure to the stressors that you're gonna feel with a barefoot shoe. When you have on a barefoot shoe, you're a lot closer to the ground. This means that you are gonna have a higher impact through the feet and ankles. And so when you're easing into the style of footwear, you're going to want to be a little strategic and selective with your usage at the onset. Otherwise, you might find that you're getting incredibly sore when wearing barefoot shoes if you've never worn them, or you might even put yourself into a situation where you just like find yourself so uncomfortable in them that you end up not liking them. And so for context and to set the stage here, I am somebody that likes to rotate their footwear. I wear running shoes, training shoes, weightlifting shoes, and barefoot shoes, depending on what I'm doing. I like to work out in barefoot shoes and I like to wear them on a day-to-day basis. They are tools for me, so I use the right tools for the jobs that I'm doing for the day of. And I filmed a video on my shoe rotation strategy up there, I'll link that up there. But basically how I conceptualize barefoot shoes is very much from like a coaching brain, so it's not necessarily the only way to approach this topic. But if you are trying to get into barefoot shoes, potentially this video could help you kind of build out that framework to help you strategically acclimate to the style of footwear so you don't get overly sore or overly beat up when switching to barefoot shoes. But now let's talk about that strategy. When switching to barefoot shoes, there are 3 pillars that I like to consider. So we have 1 pillar, 2 pillar, and 3 pillars. Now, underneath all 3 of these pillars, we have a foundational landscape, and that is our exposure to being barefoot already. Now, let's talk about that as on a spectrum. Let's say you're on this end and you have never worn barefoot shoes in your life and you're very rarely barefoot. You are typically rocking shoes, whether that's outside, indoors, etc. If that is you, you are going to want to be a lot slower with all 3 pillars that I discussed. Now, if you're on this end and you are very much used to being barefoot, you train often barefoot, but you don't necessarily wear barefoot shoes for your training, or you're just not very strategic with it, you can be a little bit more aggressive with your timeline, shoe selection, and types of surfaces you're gonna be training on, AKA the pillars I'm going to discuss. So remember, your foundational layer of being comfortable barefoot, that will then manipulate the 3 pillars I'm going to discuss now. So pillar 1 is considering the type of barefoot shoe you are using. Not all barefoot shoes are created equal in the sense of how much cushion they have. So for example, if we look at something like a Tolos Archetype 2.0 here, this is gonna be a lot closer to the ground compared to something like a Limbs model or even an Icarus model that has a thicker insole in it. Now, if you are wondering, okay, how do I know which shoe is gonna have like the most ground feel? Generally, you're gonna wanna look at the stack height of that shoe and if it comes with an insole. If it doesn't come with an insole and has a very low stack height, you can pretty much assume that that shoe is going to be a little bit harsher on the ground regarding your ground impact and how much you're going to feel the ground. If you have an insole in the shoe, or if it has a thicker stack height like most of the Limbs models, then you're going to typically have a little bit of a smoother ride, so they'll be a little bit more forgiving for anybody who's never worn barefoot shoes. If you are used to being barefoot, you can typically jump into lower stack height barefoot shoes without really having any issues or getting really overly sore when switching to the style of shoe. But if you've never worn barefoot shoes, I would suggest easing in. And now I have filmed a best barefoot shoes for beginners video that is going to be linked up there. But basically looking for shoes that have insoles in them or a slightly higher stack height if you've never worn barefoot shoes can be a nice tool to help you slowly acclimate to the style of footwear without making too harsh of an adjustment in your footwear selection. So in pillar 1, we have the different types of barefoot shoes and the different types of cushions and support that you'll get from them. In pillar 2, we have the surfaces you plan to use those shoes on. So on things like turf, on things like grass, it's gonna be a little bit softer and forgiving versus on concrete. So if you are brand new to barefoot shoes, using a more beginner-friendly barefoot shoe on something like turf and grass can be a really nice way to really ease you in slowly. Or if you're gonna be planning on wearing your shoes on concrete, using that more beginner-friendly shoe is a good move as well because it's gonna help dampen some of that ground impact you're gonna feel when wearing your shoes on concrete. Now let's say you're used to being barefoot. Pillar 2 is gonna be more dictated by Pillar 3, and just hang with me here because it's gonna make a little bit of sense here, because Pillar 2 is not gonna be necessarily as relevant to you because it's gonna highly dictate on Pillar 3, aka the types of activity you are gonna be using your barefoot shoes for. So Pillar 3 is the type of activity that you're gonna be wearing your barefoot shoes for. And this is kind of the fun section, the nuts and bolts, and where I kind of like to nerd out as a trainer, coach, and somebody who helps countless people acclimate to barefoot shoes. But basically, with Pillar 3, I like to bucket into 3 different types of activities: low threshold activities, medium threshold activities, and high threshold activities. Low threshold activities would be walking and standing, basically passively being on your feet all day. Medium threshold activities would be things like lifting, where you're a little bit more static, but you're still engaging the feet a little bit more versus walking, or even maybe doing some very steady state cardio on a softer surface, or even doing some very casual cross training stuff. So maybe like a box jump here and there with your training. You're just not going super all out with your plyometrics. High threshold activities would be your sprints. They would be your runs. They would be your plyometrics. Basically, think about any exercise or activity where you're producing a lot of force into the ground, and then you're gonna have a lot of ground impact based on what you're doing, whether that's because you're moving at a high velocity or you're just doing something more strenuous with your training. Now, how do you approach these buckets and how do you acclimate properly? So if you're brand new to barefoot shoes, you're gonna wanna hang out at the low threshold activities for a little bit and then ease yourself into medium. Basically, use soreness as your gauge. So I would suggest starting out for a couple of weeks, just wearing your barefoot shoes here and there for walking. Use time as your ability to scale or frequency during the week. And then as you feel more comfortable and as you notice you're not getting sore from walking, then start using your barefoot shoes for lifting. So doing things like split squats, deadlifts, RDLs, and whatnot, they can be awesome intros to giving you a slightly higher stimulus when being barefoot or in barefoot shoes for that matter. And now, if you're a beginner, start for a couple of weeks at the low threshold, ease yourself into medium for a few weeks, even a few months, and then you could start dabbling in the high threshold activities. If you are used to being barefoot and if you are used to having a little bit more impact through your feet, you can kind of skip the low threshold activities, or you can approach low threshold activities with a much more aggressive stance. So basically wearing your barefoot shoes all day or maybe for multiple days in a row, and then you can be a lot more aggressive with your medium threshold activities as well. Still though, if you are not used to wearing barefoot shoes full time and you are used to being barefoot, you're still gonna wanna be strategic with your high threshold activities, at least for a few weeks. I think the biggest thing to keep in mind when scaling the activities and the timelines in which you're using your shoes for is gauging off of soreness. How are you feeling the day after? If you notice that your calves, your ankles, your feet are very beat up, likely you just pushed it a little bit too hard with your intensity, so you might want to scale it back a little bit. I like to use time and frequency of use as 2 of my main factors for gauging, okay, I've worn this type of shoe for this many days in a row for low threshold activities for this timeline. To progress this, I'm either gonna add more time, more days, or get into medium threshold activities. There are like countless ways to approach this, but as long as you have some form of sound basis of kind of keeping track, and think of like progressive overload with training, that is the best way I think to acclimate to the style of footwear without overdoing it too quick. Because outside of just getting beat up and being sore with the style of footwear, if you've never worn barefoot shoes, you also have to think about how this footwear is going to change your movement mechanics. When you're training, for example, on a 0mm heel to toe drop shoe versus a shoe with something like an 8 to 10mm heel to toe drop, your mechanics are going to change a little bit. So that's why I also suggest easing in slowly through all the different buckets of activities, because you can then get a better idea of, okay, when I'm wearing a training shoe versus a barefoot shoe, that's how I'm going to move differently in this type of activity. I know that I move differently, for example, with a box jump if I'm wearing a training shoe versus a barefoot shoe, because the amount of dorsiflexion and knee flexion and hip flexion that I'm going to go through will be a little bit different. And then also, so will the ground force through the ground and then for my impact when I'm absorbing and landing my box jump. So keeping these things in mind can be incredibly useful for helping you properly acclimate to barefoot shoes in a strategic and a nice meaningful way versus just sending it and then hating the style of footwear, because I have had way too many people comment on videos after they've done that, and I don't want that to happen to you. But that said, if you have additional questions on this topic, I do have a written guide down below. It is going to be linked in the description in the top comment, or you can drop a comment and I can help you out in the comments below. I answer everybody, so ask whatever you have, or you can reach out to me on Instagram, whichever you're most comfortable with. And as always, y'all, drop a like on the video, drop subscribe to the channel. I will see you in the next one. Hopefully you're able to take something away from this barefoot shoe acclimation guide.